My wife invited her cousin to live with us, but he wasn't family. He was a professional con artist, and she was his accomplice. They thought I was too scared to do anything while they drained my savings and forged my signature on a massive loan. They were wrong. My entire job is to analyze risk, and I was about to turn all of my skills against them. My world is built on data, patterns, and predictable outcomes. As a risk analyst, my job is to look at a complex system and identify the single variable that could bring it all crashing down. I build firewalls, both digital and financial, to protect my clients from ruin. I've always applied the same principles to my personal life: a stable career, a sensible mortgage, a meticulously planned future. My life wasn't exciting, but it was secure. I thought my wife, Jessica, appreciated that stability. I now realize she saw it as a cage, and she has just handed the key to a man who is the complete opposite of me. She calls him her cousin, Chris. He appeared about a month ago, a charismatic whirlwind of easy smiles and thrilling stories about his travels. He's the kind of man who walks into a room and instantly owns it, while I'm the kind of man who makes sure the room is structurally sound and insured against fire. Jessica was instantly captivated. She told me he was down on his luck, a brilliant entrepreneur between ventures, and that he just needed a place to stay for a few weeks to get back on his feet. Her eyes shone with a kind of adoration I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Against every screaming instinct in my body, I agreed. I suppressed my professional paranoia because I feared the personal confrontation that would follow if I said no. I was terrified of being the bad guy, the uncharitable husband. Chris's presence immediately began to shift the foundations of our home. Our quiet evenings were replaced by his loud music and even louder anecdotes. He was a tactile person, always a hand on Jessica's arm, a shared laugh that felt too intimate. He treated our home like a hotel, and me like the concierge. My meticulously planned world was now contaminated by an unpredictable variable. My analyst brain, the part of me I suppress at home, began running diagnostics. The man had no digital footprint. His stories, when you listened closely, were full of contradictions. He was always on the verge of a big deal that never seemed to materialize. He was a ghost. The inciting incident, the moment my denial finally shattered, was quiet. It wasn't a dramatic discovery, but a simple observation. I came home early one day and they weren't there. On the kitchen counter was a brochure for a high-performance sports car, a model costing well over 6 figures. Next to it was an application for a personal loan, filled out in Jessica's handwriting. The amount was significant, enough to make a serious dent in our savings. Later that evening, she approached me, feigning nervousness. "Will, honey, I need to ask you something. Chris has this incredible investment opportunity, but he's just a little short on capital. I was thinking of loaning him some money, just a small amount, to help family." I looked at her, at the woman I had built my life with, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. My mind flashed to the car brochure and the loan application. The amounts didn't match. The carefully constructed lie was so transparent, so insulting in its simplicity, that it felt like a deliberate provocation. She wasn't just cheating, she was performing. A desperate, theatrical performance to feel powerful and intellectually superior to the man whose stability had become her prison. My professional instinct and my personal fear were now at war. My gut screamed that I was being conned, but my heart was paralyzed by the potential fallout. I'm standing on the brink of ruin, a ruin she is actively engineering. What do? Do I confront her now and risk an explosion? Or do I start digging and prepare for the inevitable collapse? For more stories like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And let me know in the comments, what would be your very first move? I'm reading all your advice. Thank you for the flood of comments and advice. The overwhelming consensus was to avoid direct confrontation and to start digging. You told me to treat this like a professional risk assessment, to gather undeniable data before making a single move. So that's what I did. I put my emotions in a locked box and let the analyst take over. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a hostile environment, and I needed to map out the threat. My first step was to run a comprehensive background check on cousin Chris. As I suspected, the man barely existed. No credit history, no registered addresses beyond a few post office boxes, no verifiable employment. He was a ghost, a carefully constructed identity designed to evade scrutiny. This wasn't just a red flag. It was a screaming siren. Professional con artists thrive on this kind of anonymity. Next, I turned to our finances. This was my turf. Jessica had always found my meticulous spreadsheets and financial planning apps boring. She called me obsessive. Now, that obsession was my only weapon. I didn't have to ask her for bank passwords. I had set up the accounts myself years ago. I logged into our joint savings account, the one we'd been building for our future, for a house with a yard, for a life we had both claimed to want. The money was already gone. It wasn't the small loan amount she had mentioned. It was a wire transfer for $50,000 sent 2 weeks ago to a holding company I had never heard of. The transaction was labeled investment capital. It was a clean, brutal extraction. My breath caught in my chest, but I forced myself to keep digging, to follow the pattern. I analyzed the weeks leading up to the main transfer. I found a series of smaller withdrawals, cash taken from ATMs near high-end restaurants and clothing stores I knew I hadn't visited. It was a slow bleed, a calculated siphoning of our shared resources to fund a lifestyle for her and her guest. I cross-referenced the holding company's name. It was a shell corporation, registered just 2 months prior. The sole director? An anonymous entity. The money hadn't been loaned to Chris. It had been given to him, funneled into an untraceable corporate ghost. The most corrosive part of this discovery was the timeline. She had started draining our funds before Chris even moved in. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by infatuation. This was premeditated. The entire story about him being down on his luck, his needing a place to stay, it was all a carefully scripted prelude to the main event, the financial gutting of our life together. I sat there in the dark of my home office, the glow of the monitor illuminating the stark, cold numbers on the screen. The evidence was damning, but it was still incomplete. This was phase 1. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they weren't done. The $50,000 was just a test. The real target had to be bigger. It had to be the house, our only major shared asset. I am still operating in the shadows, collecting data, while they believe I am blissfully ignorant. But now I face a critical choice. I have enough to confront her about the money from our savings, but I suspect that's just the tip of the iceberg. What would you do in my position? Should I confront them with this partial information to try and stop further damage? Or do I stay quiet and continue digging, knowing that they might be planning their final move at any moment? The advice was clear. Stay quiet, dig deeper. You warned me that confronting them with partial evidence would only make them smarter, more careful. You told me to assume the worst and prepare for it. You were right. What I found next took this from a story of betrayal to a criminal conspiracy, and it put my entire future, professional and financial, on the line. To see the full picture, I needed to go beyond our shared bank accounts. I needed to see what debt might have been taken out in my name. I used my credentials to pull our full official credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. I told myself I was looking for a car loan, something to explain the brochure I had seen. But what I found was so much worse. It was a home equity line of credit. A massive loan taken out against our house, the primary asset I had worked my entire life to secure. The loan was for $250,000. It had been approved 3 weeks ago, and sitting there on the digital copy of the loan agreement was my signature. A signature I never made. It was a nearly perfect forgery, good enough to fool a bank, but I could see the subtle hesitation in the lines, the slight tremor in a curve where my own hand would have been steady. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just infidelity. This was bank fraud, a serious felony. The money hadn't been deposited into our joint account. The loan documents showed it was dispersed directly to the same shell corporation that had received the initial $50,000. They were systematically liquidating our assets and funneling them into an untraceable black hole. My professional reputation was now on the line. I'm a risk analyst. My entire career is built on the premise that I can see and mitigate threats. How could a meticulous analyst miss this happening in his own home? If this fraud became public, it wouldn't just be a personal humiliation, it would be a professional disgrace. It would suggest a level of negligence and ignorance that could destroy my career. My grief and shock hardened into something else. Something cold, quiet, and sharp. It was the feeling I get before a major market analysis, a state of absolute clarity where emotion is a liability. I was no longer the betrayed husband. I was an analyst with a problem to solve. My wife was not just an adulterer, she was a co-conspirator. And her lover was not just an affair partner. He was a professional con artist who had targeted us from the very beginning. He had seen Jessica's resentment, her desire for a more exciting life, and he had exploited it masterfully. She thought she was his partner in crime, but she was just another tool he was using. I spent the next 48 hours in a fugue state of focused research. I used every tool at my disposal, some of them in a legally gray area, to trace the Shell Corporation and Chris himself. I uncovered a pattern of similar scams in other states, targeting couples with significant assets and a weak link, an unhappy spouse. He was a predator. Now I have everything. A complete, documented case of conspiracy and fraud, from the initial small withdrawals to the forged signature on a $250,000 loan. I hold the power to dismantle their entire scheme and send both of them to prison, my wife included. And that has forced a critical moral choice upon me. Do I go to the authorities and watch as my life becomes a public spectacle, guaranteeing my wife's prosecution and my own professional ruin? Or do I use this information as leverage? Can I outmaneuver them, reclaim what's mine, and make them disappear without ever involving the law? This is no longer about saving my marriage. It's about saving myself. So, I ask you, the community that has guided me this far, what should be my objective now? Righteous justice, no matter the personal cost, or strategic, pragmatic survival? The consensus was nearly unanimous. Pragmatic survival. You advised that involving the authorities would create a storm I couldn't control, one that would likely destroy me along with them. The goal shouldn't be justice in a courtroom, but the strategic reversal of their actions and the complete expulsion of these two people from my life. My plan was forged in that cold logic. There would be no shouting match, no tearful accusations. The climax of this story would not be a scene in a bedroom, but a meeting in a boardroom. My dining room table would have to do. I waited until a Tuesday evening. I prepared 3 folders, one for me, one for Jessica, and one for Chris. I made coffee. When they came downstairs, drawn by the unusual silence, I asked them to sit. We need to talk about our financial future. Jessica looked confused, a little annoyed. Chris had his usual smirk, as if he were observing some quaint domestic ritual. Will, can this wait? Chris and I were about to watch a movie. No, it can't. I've been doing some planning for our future, and I've uncovered a few things we need to address immediately. Please, open the folder. She opened it. The first page was a copy of our joint savings account statement, with the $50,000 wire transfer highlighted in yellow. Her face went pale. Chris's smirk faltered. He glanced at his own folder but didn't open it. As you can see, there's a significant discrepancy. I was concerned, so I dug a little deeper. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing, my voice perfectly level. That led me to the second document. It's a loan agreement from the bank. A home equity line of credit for $250,000 secured against this house. Our house. I slid a pen across the table. Jessica, I don't remember co-signing that. But my signature is right there. It's a very good forgery. Bank fraud, I believe, carries a sentence of up to 30 years in federal prison. It varies by state, of course. Jessica looked like she couldn't breathe. She looked at Chris, her eyes wide with panic. He was no longer the charismatic charmer. He was a cornered animal. He started to speak, some blustering denial, I'm sure. I cut him off before he could begin. Your folder, Chris, is a little different. It contains printouts of your previous investment ventures in Arizona and Florida. The ones involving recently divorced women and shell corporations with strikingly similar names. I also took the liberty of including the criminal records of your known associates. The authorities in those states are still very interested in speaking with the ghost who disappeared with their assets. I imagine the FBI would be fascinated to learn of your new activities here. The room was absolutely silent. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was in control. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the man with the data. Here is my proposal. This is a one-time offer. You have 24 hours to begin the process of unwinding every single transaction. You will return the $50,000 from the savings account. You will contact the bank with me on a conference call and explain that there was a clerical error, and you need to cancel the line of credit and return the full, untouched $250,000. Every penny will be accounted for. Once the money is back in my sole possession and all fraudulent debts are cleared, you will both pack your bags and you will walk out of that door. You will never contact me again. You will, for all intents and purposes, cease to exist in my world. I stood up. If you refuse, if you hesitate, if I sense for one moment that you are not complying fully, I will not call the police. I will call the FBI's white-collar crime division and hand them all 3 of these folders. I will also forward a copy to the lead detectives on your outstanding cases in Arizona and Florida. You will be ruined. She will be prosecuted as your co-conspirator. And I will take my chances with the professional fallout. I have nothing left to lose. You, however, have your freedom on the line. I left them at the table with the folders. The trap is set. The choice is theirs. I have spent the last few hours listening to their hushed, frantic whispers from the guest room. The 24-hour clock is ticking. Now I turn to you one last time before the finale. They are trapped between total financial ruin and a federal prison sentence. Do you think they will take the deal and disappear? Or will their arrogance lead them to call my bluff, forcing me to burn everything to the ground? It has been 6 months. My home is quiet again. The spreadsheets are balanced. The firewalls are rebuilt stronger than ever. I am writing this from my office, looking out at a life that is entirely my own. The answer to my last question was, as many of you predicted, that they took the deal. Desperate people, when faced with undeniable logic and catastrophic consequences, will almost always choose the path of least resistance. Their arrogance evaporated the moment they realized I wasn't playing the role of the wounded husband, but the role of a liquidator. The 24 hours that followed my ultimatum were the most surreal of my life. There was no resistance, only terrified, silent compliance. I monitored every call, every email, every digital transaction. I sat with Jessica on speakerphone as she tearfully explained to the bank's fraud department that she had made a terrible mistake and needed to reverse the loan immediately. I watched as Chris, his charisma gone, looking small and pathetic, arranged for the $50,000 to be wired back from the Shell Corporation. It was a sterile, procedural dismantling of their conspiracy. It took them 3 days to unwind everything they had built over 3 months. The day they left, there were no dramatic goodbyes. Jessica tried to speak to me once, her voice trembling. Will, I don't know what happened. I was so unhappy. I didn't look at her. I just looked at the open front door. I know. And now you're free to be unhappy somewhere else. They walked out of my house, got into a nondescript car Chris had arranged, and drove out of my life. I have not heard from them since. I had a lawyer draft divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences, which she signed and returned via courier without contest. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago. I did lose some money. There were legal fees, and some of the smaller cash withdrawals were impossible to recover. But I consider it a severance package. A fee paid to surgically remove a cancer from my life. My professional reputation remains intact. My finances are secure. My house is mine. The lesson I learned from this was not that people can be cruel or that love can be a lie. I already knew those things on an academic level. The true lesson was about myself. My greatest vulnerability was not my trusting nature, but my fear of applying my own core strengths to my personal life. I compartmentalized myself. I was a sharp, analytical professional at work and a passive, conflict-averse man at home. I was so afraid of being perceived as a controlling or suspicious husband that I willingly ignored every red flag my instincts were screaming about. I allowed the variable into the system because I was afraid of the confrontation required to keep it out. I will not make that mistake again. My life is now fully integrated. I am an analyst in all aspects of my world. Some might find that cold or lonely. I find it safe. I find it honest. My life may not be a grand, passionate performance, but it is built on a foundation of truth and it is secure. I am the sole architect now, and I am at peace. Thank you all for watching, for your advice, and for following this journey. Your insights were invaluable and provided a strange sense of community during the darkest time of my life. For more stories, please subscribe to the channel. You never know when you might need a new perspective.